there's a ton of stuff to do. Here's what I imagine I want to try to do. Finish up the whiteness. That takes 2 parts. Do Ahab for a while. Do Pip for a while. Pip is chapter 93, the castaway. And if we have time, we'll do the doubloon also, which is chapter 99. I know maybe you probably haven't read that far yet. Your job is to keep reading 100 pages a week. Finish it over Thanksgiving if possible. And what we're talking about doesn't give away the fantastic plot. It's still at the level of Melville's metaphysical or anti-metaphysical view and how it's expressed in different characters. So it shouldn't give away the plot. It should give you a kind of orientation for reading and following the plot also. So that's where we're at. I want to then back up to that crazy passage from chapter 42 that we ran out of time. I was freaking out trying to read it and couldn't get through it. So I want to go back to this passage and read it and walk through it. And at the end, we want to understand the whiteness, the dumb blankness full of meaning, and then this last line that we spent a little bit of time talking about the wretched infidel who gazes himself blind. I said in response to Lynn that maybe that's Bulkington. But as I was laying in bed and tossing and turning last night, thinking about this line, trying to figure out what it means, I had a twisted epiphany about it. And I'm going to tell you when we get there. I'm excited to share it. Okay, so let me just read the paragraph, okay? And we'll comment as we go along. Remember, he starts out saying, why is he so horrified by the white? And then he talks about cool, beautiful white things. Then he talks about scary, horrifying. Well, it's not horrifying because we have to be careful. He talks about particular things that are attractive and particular white things that are repulsive. But he doesn't imagine still going through that catalog of attractive and repulsive white things, why the whiteness itself freaks him out so hard. And so one of the questions guiding us is, why does he have horror about it? Because it's not about any white particular thing. It's about the metaphysical significance of whiteness itself. And that's what horrifies him. I was worrying about him being horrified by it, but I understand it now, I think anyway. It's because he's got a hangover from Presbyterianism. He's a recovering monotheist. And the thought that the religion in which he was brought up is just one among many possible interpretations, it still freaks him out. I think he's still got a hangover from monotheism. You can imagine somebody having this realization, this epiphany that there's no ultimate, reality itself doesn't have any ultimate truth. There's a proliferation, a multiplicity of perspectives on it, and not be freaked out by it, rather celebrate it. And Nietzsche works himself into that position sometimes, although not surprisingly, not coincidentally, when Nietzsche talks about this situation, he puts it in the mouth of a madman, a person who's gone crazy. Although later, Nietzsche tries to say, this is something about which you should be very cheerful. And I'm going to read you that passage maybe on Tuesday, or actually, maybe after Thanksgiving. I think it's after Thanksgiving when we're summing up. So that's why I think he's horrified, because he's got a hangover from monotheism. If you have a different idea, let me know when we get there, or after we get through it. It looks like you were going to say something, but I'm not sure. Can you speak up? Because everyone in the room is trying to listen to you.
Yeah, okay. He's like, holy shit, I wrote like a pretty intense book. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Because he's writing at a turning point, really. He's the first one who's articulating this in literature. And it takes another generation when Nietzsche comes around to give it a philosophical, still very literary philosophical articulation, that the monotheism of the West is breaking down. And Melville's the first one to really express it and to see it. And to be on the forefront of that realization is freaky. And you can imagine being horrified by the realization, because those 2,000 years leading up to you has been convinced otherwise. So anyway, that's the horrifying bit. That's to catch you up to where we are. Now, this is the crazy paragraph. I'm on page 164 on the Dover edition, but it's the last paragraph of chapter 42, otherwise. Is it by its indefiniteness it shadows forth the heartless voids and immensities of the universe, and thus stabs us from behind with the thought of annihilation when beholding the white depths of the Milky Way? Or is it that as an essence, whiteness is not so much a color as the visible absence of color, and at the same time the concrete of all colors? Remember, that's the idea that whiteness, you can look at whiteness just as a background illumination that doesn't have any color of its own, or you can look at it as a form of light that combines a whole rainbow, of a spectrum of colors. And that's why he calls it, it's the absence of color, or the concrete of all colors. Is it for these reasons that there is such a dumb blankness full of meaning, a wide landscape of snows, a colorless, all color of atheism from which we shrink? So, that's what we were saying, that if you consider the colors of the spectrum to be interpretations of reality or understandings of being, interpretations of the meaning of human life, and if you think of them all as being closed off, thinking they have the total answer to everything, not being able to countenance that there's other possible interpretations that could also be believable or credible for people. If the spectrum is such that it's a spectrum of totalizing, closed-off interpretations, they cancel each other out. None of them can be right if any one of them is right. From the perspective of any one of them, the rest of them are false. So they cancel each other out. Those totalizing interpretations of human beings and of reality cancel each other out. That is the absence of all color. That's the whiteness. But if you look at them as a spectrum of equally plausible interpretations of what it means to be, and don't succumb to the temptation that there has to be any one right interpretation, then you can look at it as the spectrum itself, a rainbow of sorts. We're going to see the rainbow in a second. And you get the dumb blankness full of meaning instead. It's full of meaning. It's not just canceled out meaninglessness that draws you to atheism, as he says there, a colorless all color of atheism from which we shrink. Gabriel, speak up.
Okay, so how do you pick a color, and how do you justify picking the color that you pick? Because so for example, what's his name, Queequeg, he's supposed to be like our dude who's like cool with going in and out of different colors, but like he kind of goes back to his color. We'll call it green because but like he has to have a reason to pick that color, right? Like he has to give you something, right? And I don't feel like we've gotten any of that yet. Besides, like sort of, just like he sees the way the sailors interact, and he sees that they're like sort of upset with their lives, and he's just like, that's not kind of how I want to do things. So, how do you deal with that, basically?
I don't know if we can answer that yet from the perspective of Melville, but sometime in the next 3 lectures, I think there's 3 left after this, Tuesday and then 2 after Thanksgiving. In those lectures, we're going to address that issue. Provisionally speaking, what can you do? None of us choose from out of nothing an interpretation of our lives. We're all already given traditions to draw from. So your starting point's already going to be the world into which you've been thrown, the world in which you find yourself. The trick is to not be seduced by all the old-fashioned claims that are running around that I've got the right answer, my interpretation is the right answer, because still many of the interpretations running around in the world have that view. So you got to start from where you're at is the provisional answer, without falling prey to the temptation to be a monotheist. Sarah?
I have a question on a similar note that I know like we can't answer yet, but I just want like to have it in our minds like going forward. Just 'cause I'm kind of like trying to get like further meaning out of what we've been talking about. What like does someone get out of having an accepting like open world view that someone like Ahab doesn't get?
Good. What does somebody get out of having this accepting openness, receptivity to different interpretations that Ahab doesn't get? When we get to this one chapter called The Squeezing of the Hand, you get Melville's version, Melville's answer to that. And when we talk about Ahab today, you're going to see what Ahab, we're going to get a clear picture of what Ahab, why Ahab has a crappy life, to put it bluntly. Jake.
And I think until we get to that chapter where he elaborates, what we're left with is that you would lose out on the dumb blankness full meaning. Is
Yeah.
where we can leave it for the moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in some way, we're going to tell you, I'll probably read the passage today, where this is Melville's making an attempt to revivify Homer-like polytheism. And this is something that only becomes possible once the monotheism in the West has started to break down on itself. And I'll read you that passage later. I think it's on 181, but I'm not sure. No, it's not. I'll find it later. He's trying to bring back polytheism. So when you ask, what do you get, we're also got to hark back to what we learned about human beings from reading about Homer. Dominique?
In the way Melville treats the study of whales, I'm getting hints of deconstruction, and I wanted to ask how this approach to polytheism is contrasted with postmodernism, and what
Good question.
the differences are.
Good question. When we get, at one of the last lectures, we'll talk about this. Like, where does all this leave us? And when I made my Big Lebowski joke the other day, I was trying to contrast this to postmodernism. Because I think that the worry about postmodernism is that it's kind of flaky, or it can be flaky. And it can be like, the dude might be a postmodernist, a lazy postmodernist. And maybe that's what the Big Lebowski is about. I'm not sure. There are nihilists there. I don't know. We can talk about this later. Amit?
So in the case of, if I see the
Can you talk up, please?
If I see the whiteness as being blankness full of meaning, so how would I like reconcile two interpretations that literally contradict each other? Can I believe something and its opposite at the same time? So this is like a constraint. And the second thing is that you said that in the other case where like each answer would cancel each other, so
Yeah.
this would lead to atheism. I don't think that this would lead to atheism because atheism belongs to the spectrum of colors. Because when you say you are an atheist,
That's
you have
right.
interpretations. So it doesn't lead to atheism.
I like that.
It doesn't lead to nothingness or to like nihilism or something like that.
Mhm.
It leads to the answer to the statement I don't know. Like we don't know, and that's
Yeah.
it. It's neither atheism nor nothingness. I just don't know.
Yeah.
So this would be the sense. This is the way I see it.
Okay. I think that's useful. It's a good point to say atheism is one of the colors in the spectrum, and that the way that totalizing mono views cancel each other out wouldn't necessarily lead to atheism because that's just another spectrum. When they cancel each other out, I guess what we're trying to say is that they reveal that they're one way of revealing that reality itself or the universe itself intrinsically has no meaning. They all cancel each other out, and if you insist on being a totalizing mono person, and in the face of all the other totalizing mono people, they all get canceled, and that leaves you nowhere. And except maybe with your statement, I don't know, but it's maybe a kind of paralysis. Or Ahab's dealing with something. Ahab's dealing with this. When we get to him, we'll see his version of trying to cope with this. And the alternative is the dumb blankness full of meaning style, where you don't feel seduced by totalizing mono interpretations, and you have an ability to navigate in boundless uncertainty with temporary meanings that last for a little while and go away without fear of death, celebrating what you've got, and going away when it's all over. Roughly speaking, something like that. Yeah, you got to follow it.
If you assume that nobody knows, because there is a difference between saying I believe and between saying I know. Like between people who don't know, let us talk. I believe, you believe, he believes, and that's it. And like saying that you're monotheist, it doesn't mean that you have the truth or you got the truth. You believe something, but at the same time, you agree on that everybody don't know anything. I don't know, like if you. So yeah, this subject in my mind. I don't know how to put it.
Are you trying to give an interpretation of the monotheists that doesn't succumb to this wipeout?
No, I'm against
trying to follow
New Ageism as an ideology. That's what, like, this is my, like, there is a New Ageism and there is an atheism. So, like, there is one kind of atheism that say, like, I don't know, and there is this kind of atheism that I know that there is nothing. And by saying you
Ah, yeah.
know, I don't know. Like,
I hear you. Melville Ishmael's not in that game. They think atheism in them is still too tied in the mono conversation. They want to suspend that. They want to get out of that conversation altogether. So it's not atheism. Melville and Ishmael are not atheists. They think that's not the point. That's not the question. The question is how to tune into the local temporary meanings that are around you. And that's what Ishmael's trying to do.
Yeah, by saying I
Yeah.
believe rather than I know, that's what I'm saying. Like, you can reconcile each of these spectrums.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to believe each spectrum to
Mhm.
reconcile in order to reconcile them. You have to you can believe one of them, but at the same time, asserting that you don't know, that you don't have the ultimate truth. That's what I'm saying. But
Okay.
Yeah. So that's my.
Sounds good to me. With one further correction. Melville's got this radical view that they're not going to harmonize. They're not going to all add up into something coherent. You can't put them all into one structure, all the different views out there. They don't add up to any one coherent, ultimate truth. There's conflicting, contrary interpretations out there. Some of them have nothing to do with each other. Some of them directly conflict. And that's what it's like. Thea?
Yeah. My question involves Melville's ruminations on the philosophers who sit in the crow's nest and kind of just look out on the sea.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think Melville portrays these people who to me at least, seem to be trying to like find truth in the nothingness of the ocean as negative?
What passage are you talking about?
This is chapter 35, the masthead. He talks about young lads who go up into the crow's nest and look upon the sea. He says, very often do the captains of,
There you stand, lost in the infinite series of the sea, with nothing ruffled but the waves. The trans-ship indolently rolls. Is that the passage? A sublime uneventfulness invests you. They just kind of they zone out, it sounds like to me. Does Melville have a positive view of them or a negative view of them?
Well, I think it's negative.
Yeah.
Since he says they're going to fall into the ocean.
Yeah, it's negative.
But why do you think he specifies that as negative if we're taking this interpretation of Melville saying there's lots of different ways to live life? So why is he specified?
That's good. I mean, it relates to what happens in the doubloon chapter in a little bit later. But the idea of when you're up at the crow's nest and you're looking out, you're above the fray. And you are looking down from above. And you're detached in a way that keeps you from investing yourself in the ways of life that are going on around. I think that's what he's getting at in this particular subchapter, where they get zoned out just by watching the waves roll in. And there's a detachment that doesn't bring you the suffering yet joy that comes with involving yourself in what's going on down on the ship and down in the muck with the rest of us. And so that detachment is not the way to live if you're out at sea in a finite, boundless human life. I think that's what's going on, but read it and tell me if that doesn't jive with you. Joe?
Yeah, just to kind of support actually what you were saying about as to it, which is that if you're in the crow's nest, you're sort of looking for markers.
Mhm.
So again, we might have that trying to turn the sea into land sort of thing, which is why
Yeah.
you might be critical of these folks who are doing it. And then also just to add on to the point that you were making, when you read the passage that we discussed, that you drew our attention to on Tuesday, about how to really see the whale, we have to see it livingly,
Yeah.
so as it's alive.
Mhm.
And so if you're in the crow's nest and you're detached from the situation,
Mhm.
you are trying to get this disinterested, abstract
Mhm.
perspective on
Yeah.
the sea, and then the whale's like the paradigm of the sea.
Good.
So you can just transfer that passage that we looked at on Tuesday
Yeah.
to this.
Good. Yeah, we'll see when we talk about the white noise bit we're about to come to, there's a certain amount of detachment that's good for you because it lets you get out and say, wait, all these interpretations of the reality from inside, they seem like, oh, that's really it. That must be how reality really is. If you get out of it and you can see it from outside in relation to other interpretations, you can say, it's just another interpretation. None of them are right. If you're fully involved in one, you can't as easily see that as if you're from a distance. But keeping yourself outside, you're going to lose out on what's available to you as a finite navigator in boundless oceans. So something like that. Let me read. I enjoyed that discussion, and I'm happy to see everyone asking questions, but I'm dying to get through this passage. Okay? We'll go back to it. I got to read this to you. We got to work through it a little bit. This is the sentence that begins, and when. Right after the one we just talked about, the dumb blankness full of meaning. It's such a mouthful, it's hard to read, but I'm going to try. And when we consider that other theory of the natural philosophers, that all earthly hues, every stately or lovingly emblazoning, the sweet tinges of sunset skies and woods, and yeah, the gilded velvets of butterflies and butterfly cheeks of young girls, all these are but subtle deceits, not actually inherent in substances, but only laid on from without. Let me read the first part of that sentence and the last. He says, when we consider the theory of natural philosophers that all earthly hues, then he has this beautiful list of wonderful earthly hues, all earthly hues are subtle deceits, not actually inherent in substances, but only laid on from without. That's like what I was telling you last time. Physics discovered that color isn't your experience of color, but a certain wavelength of particles moving around. There's no color in reality. Our perceptual system is built to perceive colors, but it's from what we bring to it that makes us receptive to colors. They're not out there in the things. What's out there in the things are particles moving around. They don't have colors. So philosophers called these secondary qualities. If you take 25B, you'll learn about them. And that's a way of saying reality in itself, nature in itself, doesn't have these meanings. We bring them. Reality, nature itself is meaningless. We bring the meanings. We bring the interpretations. Nature absolutely paints like the harlot. Wait, let me back up. All deified nature absolutely paints like the harlot, whose allurements cover nothing but the charnel house within. And when we proceed further and consider that mystical cosmetic which produces every one of her hues, that great principle of light, forever remains white or colorless in itself, and if operating without medium upon matter, would touch all objects, even tulips and roses, with its own blank tinge. That's another way of saying the same point. He's saying if nature itself doesn't have meanings, but it gets painted up with all kinds of makeup and beautiful clothes, like a harlot. And the mystical cosmetic, which produces every one of her hues, is the great principle of light, the way light is a metaphor for meanings. And he says, if operating without a medium upon matter, we're the medium through which nature gets meanings. If operating without medium upon matter, would touch all objects with its own blank tinge. That's just another way. The blank tinge is the pure whiteness, the absence of all color, the mutual canceling of all mono views, meaninglessness. So there's a weird double meaninglessness. Nature in itself is meaningless. We bring the meanings to it. But at the same time, there is the mutual cancellation of all totalizing mono views that produce another kind of blankness, another kind of whiteness. Okay, now there's this one sentence that I was tossing and turning about, and I'll give you my twisted epiphany. Like the willful travelers in Lapland, I still don't know what that is, but it doesn't matter, who refuse to wear colored or coloring glasses upon their eyes. In other words, reality has no color. We got to bring the colors with our lenses, with our perceptual system, or with our traditions and interpretations. So, but for people who refuse to bring any meaning of their own to reality, who refuse to accept any given interpretations, who refuse to accept that they participate in putting a meaning on reality. They refuse to wear the colored or coloring glasses. So the wretched infidel gazes himself blind at the monumental white shroud that wraps all prospect around him. So this is a crazy way of saying that just like people who refuse the project of giving interpretations to nature, they want to just live in total meaninglessness. They want to say, no, there's no meaning inherent in the world. I'm not going to bring one. I refuse to wear the colored glasses. Just like them, which is a kind of active nihilism. I don't know, but some kind of nihilism. Maybe it's Bulkington. Maybe that's Bulkington, who refuses to wear colored or coloring glasses upon their eyes. So the wretched infidel gazes himself blind at the monumental white shroud. And I was thinking to myself, what does this mean? And it occurred to me, in this course, where have we seen somebody who gazed himself blind while looking at a monumental something or other? If a white shroud is a metaphor for a mono view of the world that cancels out all other mono views, and he's talking about somebody, in this case a wretched infidel, who gazes himself blind while looking at the source of the meaning of his world, I thought, wow, we've seen that somewhere in this class. It's Dante. Dante gazed himself blind, looking at the source of all intelligibility, the mono source of all intelligibility. And for Dante, that was the highest bliss you could achieve. Melville is making some perverse criticism of this, it seems to me. I don't know if he has Dante in mind. I said it's perverse because it seems so wrong to call Dante a wretched infidel. I don't think he's calling Dante a wretched infidel. But I think he's got that kind of mono view in mind, that you gaze yourself blind by staring directly into the source of all intelligibility and all meaning. He doesn't have Dante in mind, but he has Ahab in mind. Ahab, who is the perverse completion of the mono tradition so beautifully expressed by Dante. So Ahab, I'm convinced, is the wretched infidel who gazes himself blind at the monumental white shroud. I want to say that's still an open question if you have a different intuition about who it might be. Could be Bulkington. As we'll see, it could be Pip, although it seems weird to call Pip an infidel. Although Pip is homies with Ahab, so could go either way, you'll see. Anyway, that was my twisted epiphany, that he was making some gnarly critique of Dante by calling him a wretched infidel, gazing himself blind, and by that way associating Ahab with the whole mono tradition. Claire?
So, if he's gazing himself blind by staring into, I think you said, the source of all meaning?
Yeah, a mono source of all meaning.
Yeah, so does that mean that the meaning comes from whatever that thing is? Because I thought that we just said that meaning comes from us, and like we're projecting meaning onto nature.
Good.
So how do we reconcile that?
Good. Yes. That's the Melville view, is definitely that meaning comes from us.
Okay.
And the whiteness in this whole passage, one of the versions of the whiteness is the whiteness that results when all these mono views cancel each other out, with the way all the different spectrums combine into white light. That's the mutual cancellation of all the mono views. And all those mono views we bring to reality, because reality itself is meaningless, is colorless. And that is definitely the Melville view. And when I was talking about gazing himself blind at the source of all intelligibility, I was bringing Dante talk into the mix. For Dante really thought that source of intelligibility was out there, and his girlfriend Beatrice led him up to it and then bailed on him at the last minute and left him there. So from Dante's perspective, it's really out there in the world. Melville, and in a weird way, Ahab, are now in position to see that intelligibility source of meaning is not actually in the world. We bring it. And staring into that fact will make you blind on this view. Makes Ahab blind in a certain way, we'll see. Jake.
But it makes Dante blind in a different way. Makes it the exact opposite way.
Yeah.
And
But from the Melville view, in a weird way, they add up, or they're complementary blindnesses, okay. I think.
Because they're like both blanknesses.
Yeah.
The blankness.
And they both wipe you out.
Yeah, but they're not the blankness. They're both wrong blanknesses in a sense.
Yeah. They're both ways of, I think in Melville, they're both ways of saying the mono interpretation of reality is going to ruin you. From Melville's perspective, the Dante mono view of reality will ruin you. We gave a kind of Melville reading in that sense of Dante when we got to the end there. And from his perspective, gazing like this, convinced that there's one right interpretation of reality, and damn it, I'm going to find it. Staring right into it, going for it, tracking it across the ocean. I'm going to find it. It's also going to make you blind as a wretched infidel and ruin you. And it ruins Ahab, as we're going to see. So I leave that open there, but I know if thinking about Dante was worrying you and thinking about all this is worrying you, think about it more, and let's talk about it later. I need to go on. Let's see where we got. So what we need then is not the whiteness that cancels each other out, but the more something like the dumb blankness full of meaning. We want to live full of meaning, but without being canceled out across the totalizing mono views. Ishmael's out to try something like this. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to get in sync, be receptive to the different interpretations he encounters. We're going to look at another one right away. So he can get something out of it, have an interpretation, or have an experience of a sacred, and not cling to it, not cleave to it, but move on to the next one on the adventure, on his crazy finite adventure. He is something like a receptive prism for the sacred. He can break down all the different white lights that are going around claiming to be totalizing and find ways not to be seduced by that and to be receptive to the local meanings and local traditions that are out there. This is a kind of polytheism. But what other evidence is there for this in the book about this idea that engaging with reality as a spectrum of interpretations is the highest, most interesting, adventurous, vital way to live your life? Where else do we come across rainbows? Here's the other way to ask the question. Where else do we come across rainbows or spectra in the book? Let me show you one. On page 302. This is in the last paragraph of chapter 85. It's another crazy passage. The chapter is called The Fountain, which refers to the spout. And so it's page 302 in the Dover edition. Ishmael is so weird because, I don't know, about 20 lines from the bottom, in the middle of this last paragraph that begins, "Still we can hypothesize," he just throws out there, "While composing a little treatise on eternity, I had the curiosity to place a mirror before me, and ere long I saw reflected there, and a curious involved worming and undulation, and the atmosphere over my head." I just think it's so crazy that he just says, while composing a little treatise on eternity. He is a kind of philosopher or thinker in his own way. And here he is in this philosophical mode, composing his treatise on eternity. Now jumping down, actually this is the final paragraph. He was just talking about seeing this mist coming off his own head in the mirror while he was composing his treatise on eternity. And so he says, how nobly it raises our conceit of the mighty, misty monster, to behold him solemnly sailing through a calm tropical sea, his vast, mild head overhung by a canopy of vapor, engendered by his incommunicable contemplations, and that vapor, as you will sometimes see, glorified by a rainbow, as if heaven itself had put its seal upon his thoughts. For do you see, rainbows do not visit the clear air, they only irradiate vapor. And so, through all the thick mists and dim doubts in my mind, divine intuitions now and then shoot, enkindling my fog with a heavenly ray. And for this I thank God. For all have doubts, many deny, but doubts and denials, few along with them have intuitions. Doubts of all things earthly and intuitions of some things heavenly, this combination makes neither believer nor infidel, but makes a man who regards them both with an equal eye. All that's one of his ways of saying he's not in the atheism game, by the way. He says, I regard them both with an equal eye. What we see here is that the rainbow, the spectrum of colors, the spectra of possible interpretations, is associated in this way with the white whale. And even though Ahab has more of the whiteness as a mutual cancellation of totalizing interpretations of reality, that drives Ahab mad. Ahab's got that interpretation of Moby Dick, the whale. Ishmael sees the rainbow, associates Moby Dick with the rainbow of interpretations. And by seeing that rainbow just floating in the mist coming off of his spout, he then gives this little interpretation about being neither infidel nor believer. And so this gives us some more evidence that the rainbow is associated with Moby Dick and is associated with different interpretations of reality. There's two more places I'm going to show you, but not right now. Maybe there's one. No, there's one right now, but the other one I'll tell you later. Colors are intuitions of the sacred, is another way to say what I just said. The colors of the rainbow that he sees in the midst of the spout coming off of Moby Dick are intuitions of the sacred. And he's able to appreciate them as such and find them wonderful, but not have to believe any of them in a totalizing way. So here's one more take on that, and it's so weird. It's in the chapter called A Boer and the Arcades. This is 358. Chapter 102. See, this is a kind of flashback. It doesn't have anything to do with the plot. It's him telling a flashback of some other travels he went on. He had visited this island called Arcades. And he rolls up and he finds there a huge skeleton of a sperm whale that had been turned into a temple. And this is an example of him getting in tune with the local people, with their interpretation of the sacred, and then being able to use it in his own reflections, his kind of meta-reflections on how there's many interpretations of the sacred for humanity. So let me read on 359. This is in chapter 102, 6 paragraphs in, the paragraph says, chief among these latter was a great sperm whale. After an unusually long raging gale, it had been found dead and stranded with its head against a coconut tree, whose plumage-like tufted droopings seemed his verdant jet. So there he's talking about the jet again, but associating the green droopings of the coconut tree with the jets of the that we saw in the last chapter that he was associating with the whole spectrum of colors. His plumage-like tufted droopings seemed his verdant jet. When the vast body had at last been stripped of its fathom-deep enfoldings, and the bones had been dusty dry in the sun, then the skeleton was carefully transported up the Pupella Glen, where a grand temple of lordly palms now sheltered it. The ribs were hung with trophies, the vertebrae were carved with animals of these people, and strange hieroglyphics. In the skull, the priests had set up an unextinguished aromatic flame, so that the mystic head again sent forth its vapory spout. So now there's a spout coming out and smoke, vapor from this flame or fire that they set up in the skull of the whale. And again, then, the vapor, the spout, is reminiscent of the rainbow that he saw when he was describing it in that chapter we were just reading. The mystic head again sent forth its vapory spout. That's a reference to the rainbow coming out of the spout in the other passage. While suspended from a bow, the terrific jaw vibrated over the devotees like the hair-wrung sword that so affrighted Damocles. Okay, then what do we want to get out of this? They made a temple out of the whale. Its head still has the spout coming out of it. And now in the next paragraph, we get this weird knockout variation on the whiteness story that we got from chapter 42. Let me see where I should read. In this paragraph, he's talking about weaving, a weaver's loom that has a warp and a woof. I don't know the technicalities, but one of them is vertical, one of them's horizontal, and that's how you knit the stuff together to make patterns and to make a fabric, a warp and a woof. It's what weaving practices do. They gather together the disparate threads into a coherent pattern. But you have to have both, a warp and a woof. This ends up being one of Melville's metaphors for creation or for God. The way the universe is created is in a kind of weaving. Although it's a weaving without a weaver. You'll see. Right here, we'll get to that in the Pip chapter, actually. But this is hearkening back to the Pip chapter, where there's a weaver, a warp and a woof and a weaving god that Pip confronts when he falls off the boat. For now, I just want to tell you the next part. On middle of that paragraph that says, "It was a wondrous sight," in chapter 102. "The weaver god he weaves, and by that weaving he is deafened, that he hears no mortal voice. And by that humming, we too, who look upon the loom, are deafened." So let's just think about it. Let me read that again. "The weaver god who weaves, and by that weaving he is deafened." So it's making a lot of noise. He's weaving together, the god weaver is weaving together all these disparate strings, and it's making a lot of noise. He's deafened by it. "And we too, who look on the loom, are deafened. And only when we escape it shall we hear the 1,000 voices that speak through it." I'm skipping down to the end. In all this den of the great world's loom, thy subtlest thinkings may be overheard afar. What's he talking about then? He's talking about all this noise that from up close, that's coming out from the weaving activity of all the disparate strands being woven together. It makes a white noise that has all these different coherent but intermingled when you're up close into white noise. You can't distinguish them. It's like the spectrum of the rainbow being focused into white light. When in a white noise you have a bunch of different sounds, they mingle together. You can no longer differentiate any of them in the white noise. But then he says if you stand back, and here standing back seems to have the same function as running the white light through a prism, which separates the white light into the spectrum of the rainbow of colors. Here he says if you stand back from the white noise, you hear the 1,000 voices that speak through it. That's that line. So let me read you the 3 sentences again, or the 3 lines again. "The weaver god he weaves, and by that weaving he is deafened, and he hears no mortal voice. And by that humming, we too, who look on the loom, are deafened. Only when we escape it shall we hear the 1,000 voices that speak through it." So getting the distance from the white noise enables you to see that it is comprised of several different 1,000 voices. Read that as thousands of different interpretations of reality, understandings of the sacred, religious interpretations, understandings of being. That when you get distance from them, you can see them from afar and appreciate them for what they are, rather than seeing them as a jumbled mutual cancellation of white noise, like the white is a mutual cancellation of the spectrum of rainbows. So this is our claim is that this is another version of Melville making the same move. Whether or not he's conscious that he's doing this and saying, I've got to make the same move with the whiteness story, with white noise here, who knows? But he's channeling this intuition that he has, that reality is not a simple thing. It's a fundamentally meaningless thing that has thousands of possible interpretations of it that cancel each other out from one perspective, but then can be appreciated as this beautiful panorama of interpretations from another perspective. And that's what Ishmael is trying to do, and Melville's trying to convince us to do. So that concludes the whiteness thing. Let me see what I have here. Yeah. Okay. So then I have two questions before I go on. I already answered one of my own questions, which is, why does he talk about this as horrifying? If he's trying to convince us this is awesome, and that this is special, and this is what our gift is, in a way, by being finite creatures who can be tuned into all kinds of different interpretations of reality, and isn't that beautiful? And shouldn't we be polytheists again? Why does then he describe the whiteness as a horror? I gave you my provisional answer, which is I think he's got a hangover from monotheism, and he can't help but be horrified by it, because from that perspective, it's totally freaky. But maybe once you get over that, you can simply celebrate it, like Nietzschean cheerfulness, which I'll read you about later. Winton, speak up.
Yeah. Can you also think of it like Nietzsche, in a sense, was also like he had a certain fear to the crashing of like mono perspectives, because without it, there is the threat, at least, of nihilism. And so it's like he had like a certain incredible foresight into that, like with the loss of like an institution like religion, that people can run, like you could run amok in like amorality or like living the wrong way or something like that. So could it be horrifying in that sense to Ishmael as well? Could it be like a certain fear that it can also lead you like astray?
Yeah, that sounds right to me too. He has a premonition that people need these interpretations. We've needed them, at least ever since, for about 2,000 years. This is again Nietzsche's view. He says we've been kind of brainwashed by 2,000 years of religious prophets and philosophers and priests who have convinced us that we really need a stable, overarching, complete interpretation of reality, and that we've become a kind of meaning addict. We need it. We need to be assured that our life has meaning in a stable, coherent, totalizing way. And so without that, because we've become kind of addicted to it, without it we would crumble. We wouldn't be able to make decisions. We wouldn't be able to cooperate with each other. There's a fear that without that, since we've become so weak and dependent on it, we would lapse into nihilism or chaos, or who knows what. Things would crumble. And so perhaps Ishmael is tuned into that danger too, and he finds that horrifying. It's plausible. It depends how much. We'd have to see what other evidence we can find for him being aware of that danger in the book. But on the face of it, there's so much similarity between his take on this and what we'll see from Nietzsche. Sorry to those of you who haven't read Nietzsche before, but I swear I'm going to read the passages to you when the time comes. Actually, we've already made a handout that we're going to put on the B-Space for you, so don't worry. Now I got one other question. It was I think it was Claire's question, because I went away last night. It was some version of Joe's question and Claire's question from yesterday. And I thought, and when I'm going back to review Professor Dreyfus's lectures, I see him flipping back and forth on this issue. So I thought it's worthwhile to bring it to you all too. When Melville says there is only a multiplicity of interpretations, and that there's no totalizing interpretation, there's only a multiplicity of them, does he mean that as just another color on the rainbow? Is that just says, well, this is my suggestion, like when he's interpreting the painting at the beginning of the book, he says, here's my theory. And Ishmael, all along in the book, he's hedging and saying very provisionally that this is what he thinks. So that gives us evidence to think that this interpretation of the status of interpretations is just another one. And what you should do is take it as just another possible move in the rainbow. So is that it? Or in response to Claire on Tuesday, I tried to say it was something more deeper than that. And I tried to say that Melville wants to undercut those other totalizing views. And that he's responding to something that shifted, that he can see now in the culture, that shifted, that monotheism's become incredible, and that we can't believe it anymore, and that it's crumbling, and that what we should do is not have it, and that what we need then is an interpretation of human beings that lets us see what we're capable of is having multiple interpretations. So in that sense, it wouldn't be on the same level as the other rainbows. It would be deeper than that. This would be, I called it, using a Heideggerian phrase that's kind of funny sounding, it's a primordiality claim. That he's got a more primordial interpretation. That just means deeper. And that's a Heideggerian term. Heidegger in Being and Time says he gives a more primordial interpretation than all the other interpretations of human beings that have been out there. Because his interpretation can explain those other interpretations, but they can't explain him. He's got a view about how you can proliferate interpretations of human beings. And it looks to me like the whiteness of the whale chapter has something like that. That if you've got this, what human beings are meaning-making machines. We are fundamentally interpreters of reality. And that seems to be at a different level of primordiality, a deeper claim than just like all the other possible interpretations. We're creatures of God. We are Athenians who've overcome the old gods, the struggle between the old gods and the new gods. We are postmodernists who've gotten over all interpretations. We are steampunks who go back to a pre-technological age, inspired by Mad Max, or whatever, you know. It's like you've got this whole range of possible interpretations, and I want to say that Melville's view isn't just on that same level. He's got a primordiality claim that can explain what we are interpreting beings. And it's therefore what we need to do is not close ourselves in on any one single interpretation, but explore the range of possible interpretations. Claire?
This might be a stretch, but when they use the analogy of the prism and shining the light through the prism to create the rainbow of colors, is it possible that Melville's view is the light that we're shining through the prism to create the colors? So
Right.
it can't be one of the colors that is created from that?
That would get the primordiality story. Yeah. And that it's not just the whiteness of the light, that because the whiteness on this view is like the mutual cancellation of all totalizing views. And that's what Ahab's freaked out about, as I'm about to tell you. And the dumb blankness full of meaning is the way you're able to look at that light and all the rainbow of colors in it without having to succumb to any one totalizing interpretation and being able to navigate and appreciate the variety of them. And the primordiality claim that that's fundamentally what we are would go along with that idea that it's the light itself. And it's so Heideggerian at the same time, because Heidegger says too that he uses this metaphor of light. He calls it the Lichtung in German. It's the clearing we translate it as, but the word is Licht, light. That it's in the light of our understanding of being that things show up to us. So thank you. I like that very much. I wanted to get this guy because he doesn't talk very much. What's your name again?
Eric.
I thought I saw you raise your hand.
Well, I know in the Dreyfus chapter in All Things Shining, he talks about that Melville ellipses at the end, like the baptism.
Yeah.
And it almost seems like the ellipses itself is the prism.
Nice.
Undecided aspect.
Yeah. The forever incompleteness. And it's because you're forever incomplete, that we're fundamentally incomplete, boundless kinds of beings, and reality itself is boundless. That's why it demands interpretation. And that is the point that they make in the All Things Shining chapter about the ellipses. It's the last paragraph in the chapter on Moby Dick. I think we're going to post this for you on the B-Space, you'll see. They have Professor Dreyfus and Sean Kelly, who wrote a book based on this course, have a chapter on Moby Dick in the book, and it makes this point that Eric, is that your name again? That Eric's making. The ellipses, the emptiness, the incompletion, the boundlessness. That's what makes us, that demands of us that we give interpretations of things. And that sounds to me like not just another interpretation. But I might just be imposing my my own prior prejudices, but that's what we got to do anyway. Theo?
There's this odd quote Melville has in chapter 45 where he's talking about the history of the sperm whale, and he says, so ignorant are most landsmen of some plainness and most wonders of the world.
Read it louder.
Oh, okay. So ignorant are most landsmen of some of the plainest and most palpable wonders of the world, that without some hints touching the plain facts, historical and otherwise, of the fishery, they might scout at Moby Dick as a monstrous fable, or still worse and more detestable, a hideous and intolerable allegory.
That's awesome.
So, I'm just, this quote bothers me because right here, Melville's like, no, don't put any meaning onto Moby Dick. Well, I guess that fits in with the idea that Moby Dick is everything. But if he's saying that we're supposed to take Moby Dick as it is, I think that supports more your claim that it's like an underlying interpretation of the world instead of just this is a way to live. So,
Wonderful. Yeah, Moby Dick. Moby Dick is the incarnation, so to speak, of the boundlessness, the incompletion of reality or of human beings, and in that way, it's the incarnation of the requirement that reality be interpreted, that we interpret ourselves, that there is no inherent meaning that we're answerable to, that we create these meanings, and the next step that Melville makes is that we should not believe any one of them all the way. We need to be able to circulate among the vast proliferation of them, and that's the best way to be a human being. That's what it is to go back to polytheism. So I hope that your passage still supports that view. I want to do some Ahab while we have time. Okay? Let's see. I'm gonna say a bunch of stuff about Ahab and then read a bunch of quotes. So let me just tell you what Ahab stands for on our view. And it goes in two notches. There's the first incomplete version of it, and then there's an interesting, weird twist we give to him at the end. Because he looks to us like the final monotheist, or the kind of perverse completion of the tradition of monotheism that we saw beautifully expressed in Dante. For that reason, the polytheistic pluralism of all the different ways of life that he sees around him is fundamentally intolerable to him. He kind of can't stand it. He can't stand that the world might not actually have this one mono meaning that he has been after. Living in the polytheistic way is so against what our Western culture has trained us to demand of ourselves and of our world. And Ahab then is so much in that tradition that the sensitivity that he has, that there's all these other possible interpretations, he can't take it. So he wants to force the universe to give an answer. He won't accept the proliferation of meanings, and this is symbolized in his pursuit of the white whale. If the white whale is the incarnation of the vast proliferation of interpretations of reality, the way reality just is, this boundless, unending interpretation, then that's what Ahab can't stand, and he's going after it. Is your question on this point?
Yes.
Okay, tell me.
When you were talking about nature being covered in makeup or whatever it was, for example, it made me think about that line that I talked about the other day, behind the mask.
Oh yeah, we're going to read that.
That's what I think especially makes Ahab's story so tragic, is that he's trying to find meaning and that like one coherent reality behind that mask and behind the mask as it makes in that line. So he's searching for meaning through the whale, but there's nothing there. Like there's no, it's a meaningless endeavor, and Starbuck considers it a meaningless endeavor in the way that he says like, oh well, it's just like pointless. Why are you chasing after an animal? But it also has this double layer to it where it's a meaningless endeavor because there's no meaning after you get Moby Dick.
That's right. Yeah, he's got to find out the hard way. Or he doesn't even find out is the sad part. He just, well, you'll see. I shouldn't have said that. Ahab is unable to stand uncertainty. He thinks that there is a God. Well, here's the simple version. I already kind of gave away the more interesting version, but I'll elaborate it in a second. The simple version, and the version that you hear a lot in other interpretations of Moby Dick, is that Ahab wants to take vengeance on God because he can't stand the injustice of the world. And he personifies the white whale as this evil, malicious creature that has focused all the evil in the world. And he's been a victim of this whale. And so he wants to avenge himself, not only for his own personal wound. He got his leg taken off, like a blade of grass, it says. He wants to avenge himself not only for his own wound, because for him, he cannot stand this bad creature. He cannot stand this evil in the world, and he wants to avenge himself against God and creation. This is a way that he's read a lot, and there's something to it. There's some good quotes that say that. Let me just read you one of them. He's out to take vengeance upon God for his suffering. Page 401.
What chapter?
I'll tell you when I get there. It's in chapter 119, the candles. It's in, I don't know, 4 paragraphs from the end of that. But this is one of these insane scenes where he's holding up a lightning rod, because he's been hit by lightning, actually. If you read the descriptions of him, one of the descriptions that he has this weird scar running from head to toe, and it happened to him because he got struck by lightning. And Ishmael describes him too at one point as he likens him to one of those trees that gets hit by lightning and charred, and the inside gets torn out, but the tree still grows and it's strong. But it's been charred from the inside out, and it has no insides anymore. So he compares Ahab to this kind of tree that's been hit by lightning. And so he's out there holding up this lightning rod, and he says on 401 in chapter 119, "Till in the sacramental act so burned by thee, that to this hour I bear the scar, I now know thee, thou clear spirit, and I know now that thy right worship is defiance." Skipping down a few lines. "In the midst of the personified impersonal, a personality stands here." So he's holding himself up. Defiance is the right worship. Now on the next page over, Starbuck is appalled by this behavior, because Starbuck is the kind of good believing Christian on the boat still, and he's always freaked out by both Ahab and by Ishmael and by Queequeg. He kind of can't stand any of them. And he says, Starbuck grasped Ahab, well, I guess both. It's grasped Ahab by the arm. "Good God is against thee, old man. Forbear, 'tis an ill voyage. Ill begun, ill continued. Let me square the yards while me weigh, old man, and make a fair wind of it homewards, to go on a better voyage than this." So Starbuck sees that Ahab has this interpretation that he's after God, and as Starbuck sees it, God is also after Ahab. The weird, interesting move is that Ahab is then after Moby Dick as a kind of vengeance, but at the same time, as we said, we think it's more interesting to read him as being unsettled by his dawning sense that monotheism has broken down, and that the one truth he was holding on to, he can no longer hold on to. That the mono interpretation of security, completion, stability, that you can rely on an interpretation of the world that's been given you in a mono tradition. That's what Ahab wants very much, and he sees that he can't have it anymore, and it freaks him out. Let's see. There's a ton of quotes, but I can't read them all. Let's see where I got one of that I just said. There's a really good one on that on 375, which is in chapter 108, Ahab and the Carpenter. And he is talking to the carpenter. Where is this? It's like in the second paragraph. He says, I like a good grip. I like to feel something in this slippery world that can hold, man. What's Prometheus about here? The blacksmith, I mean. What's he about? The point is there, he says, the point is that I like a good grip. I like to feel something in the slippery world that can hold, man. Let's see, 169, I've got a good one. In Ahab's case, this is 169, chapter 44, at the very end of it. Yielding up all his thoughts and fancies to this one supreme purpose. That purpose, by its own sheer inveteracy of will, forced itself against gods and devils into a kind of self-assumed, independent being of its own. He's talking about his maniacal obsession with going after the white whale. And we're reading that as his maniacal obsession to find out, to be relieved of his doubts, to be convinced that his mono view and mono tradition is still sustainable. This has possessed him and taken him over. Ahab rushed from his room. Was a time, that vacated thing, a formless, somnambulistic being, a ray of living light to be sure, but without an object to color, and therefore a blankness in itself. Just wanted to underline that. It's 4 lines from the bottom of 44. A blankness in itself. He's associated again with the blankness that results when mono views cancel each other out. Sarah?
I'm just curious, like, when you're saying sort of his, like, maniacal need to have his, like, mono view affirmed.
Yeah.
What would that look like? Would that be, like, him ultimately slaying his whale and feeling fulfilled? Is it, like, because fulfillment was a word we use a lot in Dante, I don't know if that is applicable here, but, like, what would that be for him?
If he was able to be, I mean, the two things are linked. You know, his idea that the whale has been after him maliciously goes with his idea that there is a God, and that God sent this whale to attack him. And so, in a way, if he can be convinced that the whale is maliciously going after him, it gives him confirmation for his interpretation that there is a God who can explain everything. And the reason why he's lost his leg and had a hard life since then is because this God is trying to punish him. And so he's looking for confirmation of that. And in his interpretation of the white whale as vicious, he can get that. The weird thing is that the white whale doesn't give a damn about Ahab. Actually, the white whale neither gives a damn or doesn't give a damn about Ahab. Let me show you that because that's the interesting move. Although, I still have time, yeah. That is on page 154. We're in chapter 41. By the way, the beginning of chapter 41 is one of the awesome places where Ishmael reveals how he gives himself over to Ahab's mood too. Ishmael is in all kinds of moods. Usually his meta mood is to be involved in as many moods as possible. But among the many moods that he gets involved in is this monomaniacal Ahab mood. And the opening paragraph of chapter 41 is a nice expression of that. He says, I, Ishmael, was one of that crew. My shouts had gone up with the rest, my oath had been welded with theirs, and the stronger I shouted, and more did I hammer and clench my oath, because of the dread in my soul. A wild, mystical, sympathetical feeling was in me. Ahab's quenchless feud seemed mine. I love that. So, going in several pages from that, we're in the middle of chapter 41. And in this paragraph that begins his 3 boats. This is when Ahab had been is meeting Moby Dick. he says, that was Captain Ahab. I'm a couple lines in from there. And then it was that suddenly, sweeping his sickle-shaped lower jaw beneath him, Moby Dick reaped away Ahab's leg, as a mower a blade of grass in the field. So let's just read that again. This is when Ahab loses his leg. That was Captain Ahab. And then it was that suddenly, sweeping his sickle-shaped lower jaw beneath him, Moby Dick had reaped away Ahab's leg. Here's the crucial line that you need to underline. As a mower a blade of grass in the field. So they're likening the way Moby Dick takes out Ahab's leg to the way a mower takes out a blade of grass. Jake?
This is could be some nothing, but in the very beginning, do you remember when he walks into the inn and he's describing all the weapons he sees? He sees a sickle.
Nice.
And describes it as a mower.
And
that is weird.
Good move.
And that's right before he sees the big whale jaw with Jonah inside of his selling alcohol.
That's good. There's so much contained in that spouter end scene. It's
Yeah.
cool. Now, but look what Ahab does. So Melville describes it as it's like a mower blade taking out a blade of grass. But, does a mower blade care about the blade of grass? And neither cares or doesn't care. I mean, it's just doing what it does, mowing grass. No turbaned Turk, no hired Venetian or Malay could have smote him with more seeming malice. Seeming malice. So, for Ahab, the way that a whale got him was with malice. But the way it's described as the way a mower takes out a blade of grass. So the way a mower takes out a blade of grass, then, is the way of looking at it as indifferent. Or not indifferent, it's beyond difference and indifference. It's just meaningless event. From the perspective of Moby Dick, it's a meaningless event. From Ahab's interpretation is that this whale has been after him with malicious intent. And so then Ahab feeds into that his whole interpretation that this whale is out to get him, and the whale is a symbol of God, and he needs to take vengeance on that. So Ahab's pursuit of it then takes the example of his pursuit for God. But he already has the intuition that that's not the case, that it was just an indifferent happenstance, a brute event, like a mower taking out a blade of grass. Ahab seems to have an intuition of that, and that seems to gnaw at him. That's something about his mighty, Ishmael describes him as having a mighty woe. So he seems to know, he has an intuition that actually there is no ultimate significance, and that drives him all the more crazy to go after the whale. So, but you can decide for yourself too. Keep this in mind whenever the final passage happens and the final confrontation between Ahab and Moby Dick happens. Does he go out like a mower and a blade of grass, or does Moby Dick take him out with total malice? That's what you got to wait and see. I have to read these other couple of passages because they drive the point home that he's the monomaniac, where monomaniac stands for the last maniacal monotheist. So I'm looking on page 138 and 139. It's the chapter called The Quarterdeck, chapter 36. And over and over and over again in this chapter and in chapter 41, where we just were, he's described as maniacal. Actually, sorry, we should stay there. It's in the same chapter we were, chapter 41. Around that same passage I was reading about the blade of grass and the malice. The white whale swam before him. I'm just a few lines down from the malice. The white whale swam before him as the monomaniac incarnation of all those malicious agencies which some deep men feel eating in them, till they have left living on with half a heart and half a lung. The intangible malignity. I'm skipping that. Go down to the next paragraph, the first sentence. It is not probable that this monomania in him took its instant rise at the precise time of his bodily dismemberment. Skipping down a little bit. It was only then, on the homeward voyage, after the encounter, that the final monomania seized him. Skipping down a bit more. As in this narrow-flowing monomania, not one jot of Ahab's broad madness had been so far left behind. And in that broad madness, not one jot of his natural intellect had perished. So Ahab's trying to interpret this wale as the concatenation of all the evil forces in the world. That gives him some confirmation that he's important in the world, that God has some significance for him. God has chosen him to take this great punishment. He would therefore be confirmed in his mono-belief. But at the same time, gnawing in him to his great woe is that he's just like a blade of grass in an indifferent event that doesn't matter at all. And lastly, that passage that Gabriel brought that last time. It's on page 138 to 139. And we'll end with this. Chapter 36. A few pages in. Um, 138 in the Dover edition. So Starbuck is freaking out because Starbuck is a Christian and he's like, this is just a dumb animal. He's not after you. So Starbuck says, vengeance on a dumb brute that simply smote thee from the blindest instinct. Madness, to be enraged with a dumb thing, Captain Ahab. It seems blasphemous. We're going to come back to this. And Ahab says, hark ye yet again, that little lower layer. All visible objects, man, are but pasteboard masks. In each event and the living act, the undoubted deed, there is some unknown but still reasoning thing puts forth its moldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. So that's a weird way of saying you see things, and behind those things is a deep meaning. And that deep meaning is the purpose that's put there by God, and that's what that wale means to me. If a man will strike through the mask. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white wale was that wall, shoved near to me. Sometimes I think there's nothing beyond, but 'tis enough. That's a clue again. Sometimes I think there's nothing beyond. He kind of gets it, that there's nothing beyond. He tasks me, he heaps me. I see in him outrageous strength with an inscrutable malice, sinewing it. So he's holding both thoughts in his mind. That sometimes I think there's nothing beyond. At the same time, there's an inscrutable malice, sinewing the outrageous strength. And here it is, the awesome line where you can reveal that it's the inscrutability, the uncertainty that really gets to him. That inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. And be the white wale agent, or be the white wale principal, I will wreak hate upon him. Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me. Whew. So that is him. That reveals that he's got this conflict. He sees Moby Dick as a symbol of God after him, his monomaniacal view, but at the same time, he subtly knows he's just a blade of grass in a meaningless sequence of events, and he can't get away with his interpretation. Okay, that's it. We're on time. Keep reading. And we'll go on later. That was chapter 36. Next time we'll do Pip and the doubloon, just so you know.